Hi, everybody. Professor Sackett-Taylor here with another video lecture for Econ 321 Natural Resource Economics. This lecture is going to focus on content from Chapter 15 on population and the environment. Overall, in the past 200 years, we've seen increasing population growth. That means that we started if we look back all the way to 1800, we started with a population at that point in time of about 1 billion people. By 1950, we had more than doubled that. And then by 1985, more than doubled that again. So we started to see after 1950, what we call exponential growth. We currently have, the estimate is about 7.9 billion people living on the earth. And there are some estimates saying that by 2050, we might even reach, by 2030, we might reach 10 billion. This population is not evenly dispersed. We can see that in general, we're looking at places, the continents of Africa and Asia as the places where we have the greatest density of human population, followed by Europe and Latin America, then North America. And the reason that North America is not up there on the scale of densely populated is largely because of the land that is Canada. There's just a lot of land up there and not as many people. So we can see here, though, also that population growth, as it's projected out through 2050 and into 2100, that we anticipate world population by 2100 to exceed 11 billion. And in that time, we're looking at a huge increase in the population of Africa, but a moderate decrease in the population of Asia, the population of Europe, and the population of Latin America. So shifts in where population growth is happening the fastest. Why does all of this matter? Like, what is the connection here? The connecting tissue between population and the environment is all about sustainable resource use. Remember that we define sustainability as our ability to provide the typical person alive in the future a standard of living, both material and environmental, that is at least as high as the typical person alive today. So we want to maintain standards of living, if not increase them for future generations. Well, in order to do that, we have to take into account the size of those future generations of people. In general, the Earth is fairly resilient. We have a term that we call ecosystem resilience, and this is essentially the functionality of those complex interdependent systems to survive over time. This is one measure of sustainability, essentially looking at ecosystem resilience against the balancing force of the pressure from population growth. Population growth eventually always will put a strain on scarce resources. And as humans, and we know psychologically in our human nature, when we begin competing for resources, we see the following things happen. The first is war. We'll have population spillover effects where people that are in certain areas become so overpopulated that they have to expand out into new areas. And this will create geographic disputes over boundaries between countries. The competition over resources also creates sometimes violent conflict. Moreover, we're going to see large portions of the population in increasing levels of famine because population growth is beginning to surpass global food supply. And as those population centers become more dense in terms of people per square mile, then we're going to see a lack of water sanitation and limited access to healthcare, which could cause greater spread of disease. So let's back up a second. Now that we kind of get the big picture, we've zoomed out and looked at why population matters when we're thinking about natural resource management. So let's zoom back in and talk about the factors that contribute to population growth. And so at the microeconomic level, we're really looking at the economics of family size. That is the individual choice that a household has around how many children they would like to bring into the world. And we can always look at this as a cost benefit analysis. So when we're thinking about the costs and the benefits of having a very large family, having a large number of children. Well, because we know that, especially in developing countries, there are still fairly high infant and child mortality rates, then one of the benefits of having a large family is that risk aversion, that you're kind of ensuring yourself that if you have 10 children, hopefully 5 of them survive childhood. And I'm just making up those numbers right now because the numbers vary drastically by region. But the point being that you put in some economic insurance in that more children means you have more hands for work. And if you have more of them, then it's okay to lose a few. Now, this is a really hard thing for a lot of us to stomach in the developed world, but it's a very real mindset for those people who are living in areas that have very high infant and child mortality rates. And so additional hands can be supplemental to their income. The whole family works, including the children. The costs of a large family are that even though you potentially have more workers and more income, and you've staved off the risk of losing children, the children who survive have additional food needs and require, at least in the very, very early years of infancy, there's a time cost associated with child rearing because those children are not able to be independent yet. So taking into the cost, into account these costs and benefits, there tend to be two primary strategies around family size. The first strategy would be have very few children and invest heavily in each one. So put in a lot of time, money, and other resources to ensuring their survival into adulthood, providing a very healthy diet, sending them to school, making sure they're educated. All of these things require a great number of resources. And so it's easier to split those resources among fewer children than among many. So one strategy is high investment across few children. The other strategy that aligns with this benefit cost analysis is to have many children, but invest fewer resources in each one. So some are likely to die very young, but the survivors will work. So this is a low investment per child, having many children strategy. So we know that population growth is putting a strain on our natural resource systems and the availability of natural capital and environmental resources. So there are a number of ways in which governments and policymaking bodies have attempted to control population growth. Now, really, if you want to start from a macro perspective, there are two categories of population control. There's voluntary population control, in which you put in incentives and education into the mix and hope that people make the decision to birth fewer children or have access to those decisions. On the flip side of the coin are coercive policies or requirements, mandates, laws that are put in place by governments or governing bodies. And so that's a separate conversation. For right now, let's just look at voluntary population control measures. And they tend to fall into 4 subcategories here: ensuring balanced growth and redistribution of wealth, reducing infant and childhood mortality, increasing access to education, and increasing access to family planning. And in the next few slides, I'll go into each of these. So the idea behind the balanced growth strategy is to eliminate poverty. And because we believe that there is a feedback loop associated with being impoverished and not having access to ways of limiting the number of births that a family has. And so what we tend to find is that people who are financially stable or wealthier tend to have fewer children. And that's the few children, high investment strategy. And so that's really hard to implement if you have very few resources to begin with. So by eliminating poverty, we empower people to choose for themselves the high investment, few children strategy. The way that we do this is we redistribute wealth. We take things like healthcare and education and provide them publicly through government entities so everyone has equal access to them. We also can, in some areas, reform land policy to divide up large estates so that wealth isn't concentrated in the hands of a few. Reducing child mortality also incentivizes the high investment, fewer children strategy, because you don't have to build in extra children as a risk measurement or as a risk measure to ensure their survival. So the idea behind this is improving public health outcomes, right? The risk associated with investing in a child's health and education is reduced if we ensure that people have access to public health resources. So at first, in the short run, what's likely to happen from this kind of strategy is that we would actually accelerate population growth because people would continue to have the same number of children and more of them would survive. There would be an adjustment period there, but in the long run, when people realize that the risk of losing their child early in life, it has been lowered, they're likely to choose to have fewer children. Education. So as women are the half of the population, or I really should say people who are capable of carrying pregnancies are the half of the population that really have the highest burden here in terms of choice. One of the things that the research shows us is that the more educated a person is, the fewer children they will want to have. Access to education is what encourages the higher investment model, the high investment, fewer children model. This also will create an economic impact in terms of, with higher education levels, people are likely earning higher wages, which allows them that high investment in a fewer amount of children. All of this to say, the choice around how many children to have requires, as a baseline, access to family planning resources. And what I mean here is we need to invest in making sure that each individualized population has access to the most cost-effective solution for them. So this is not a one-stop shop. This is like a continuation of services that need to be made available throughout a lifetime. And so we need to make different forms of birth control accessible and affordable to all people who could carry a pregnancy. We need to offer follow-up and support services throughout pregnancy to give the maximum chance of good prenatal care. We need to offer a variety of contraceptive methods because what works for one person's family might not work for another. And we need to create a network of well-trained workers who can work with the people who are carrying pregnancies to assure them that they know all of the available options that they have. And so there have been a number of studies that have estimated that if we just spent $5 billion globally on family planning alone, we could reduce the population by 500 million people in the next 10 years. Unfortunately, there are lots of examples I mean, not lots. There are a handful of examples of compulsory or coercive population control policies. Probably the most famous one is China's one-child policy. It was in place from the 1970s through the mid 2000 teens. And it essentially had a lot of um, unintended consequences. So culturally in China, male children are favored over female children because of the way that wealth is passed through generations, and also because of culturally who's expected to care for aging parents. And so what happened is that people who were only allowed to have one child didn't want that one child to be female. They wanted that one child to be male. And so it really increased the number of female children who were aborted prior to birth and or killed after birth, immediately after birth, a large number of selective abortions on female fetuses. And so what happened over time as a result of people pre-selecting for male births is now China has a population of people that where the number of men in their society drastically outweigh the number of women in their society. And so there are a lot of heterosexual men who cannot find partners because there are literally many fewer women in the population. Another thing that has happened is that when children are born outside of the one-child policy, those children become essentially undocumented in their own country. They're kind of like hidden away from society, and therefore they don't have any documentation, so they don't have access to education or healthcare or travel the same way that people who are documented are. It's estimated that about 13 million, and I'm going to say that this is a drastically underestimated measure, but about 13 million children do not legally exist inside of China and have no access to services. We have seen other countries also attempt similar policies. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Nigeria, at points in history have had similar policies that have had similarly tragic effects. It's estimated that over 125 million women are missing from the population, either because they were pre-selected for abortion, killed right after birth, or neglected and undocumented, which often led to early death because they are homeless and have no access to resources. So this is really tragic. I guess I could spin the good news on this is that China has loosened the one-child policy to a two-child policy most recently. And I think we have to wait and see how this goes going forward. But the good thing is that the Chinese government is at least acknowledging that there have been some unintended consequences of this policy and that things needed to change. So this is the trajectory that the United Nations has estimated for future population growth. And basically all of it depends on educational development, like how much access we get into those developing countries for women and girls to access forms of formal education. And so you can see that this like thick dotted line is where we would like to be, actually, where like population would reach a peak around 2050 and then stabilize, perhaps even decline slightly after that. But that really is requires a sincere